Welcome again to our Surfacing Creative Leadership conversation on the driven dimension of the Leadership Circle profile. Our world needs creative leadership, and we at Leadership Circle know that you, coaches and leaders, are in the best position possible to provide that, whether that's through your own leadership or in the way that you guide others to grow into theirs. With our Surfacing Creative Leadership series, we're hosting ongoing conversations to unpack, demystify, and surface insights from within the dimensions of the LCP, one dimension at a time. Today, we're exploring driven, the reactive tendency that, when over-indexed, turns effort into excessive need to perform, leading to overextension, exhaustion, and burnout. To get us started, we'd love to hear from you. How does driven show up in you and in your leadership? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. And while you're doing that, it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our featured coaches today, Abigail Jones and Josh Best. First, I'm thrilled to welcome Abigail Jones. Abigail is an ICF certified executive coach, technology exec, and founder of Conduit Partners. She leads Leadership Circle profile coaching engagements for C-suite teams and designs leadership development workshops and retreats that integrate improv comedy, outdoor adventure, and social innovation to help leaders build self-awareness, align values with action, and lead effectively in complex systems. And listen, she had me at improv comedy, to be honest. I'm also really excited that joining Abigail and me today is Josh Best, founder and principal of 3 Arrows Coaching and a Leadership Circle senior leadership consultant and executive coach. Josh is known for his strong coaching acumen and a leadership approach grounded in sustainability, helping leaders build the awareness, the capacity, and the habits that are necessary to perform effectively over the long term. His work supports leaders in navigating complexity with clarity and intention, creating impact that lasts way beyond short-term results. Josh, Abigail, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for the warm welcome. You are great at introducing, Sarah. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So listen, I want to jump right in because we've got a lot to cover today, and I know it's going to be a great conversation. So let's dig in first just on the basics and kind of get a level set on what driven is all about. In your work, debriefing, coaching, working with leaders, how do you introduce the dimension of driven? When we talk about this as Leadership Circle, what do we mean? What are we talking about?
Abigail, you want to start us out, or you want me to?
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off. The way that this often shows up is that a person has achieved a lot of results in their career up till now, and one way I like to introduce it, and that Josh and Sarah and I were talking about the other day, is that this aspect in particular is incentivized across our cultures in professional domains and in popular culture. So it's important, I think, to acknowledge that from the start, that this behavior and mindset is going with the grain, and there's a lot of momentum and force that reinforces these inner mindsets and outer behavior. And it's tied to the idea that your sense of self-worth is related to the results that you produce externally. So acknowledging that this likely got you to a place where you're in a position of leadership is, I think, an important first step to acknowledge. And there was some chatter about that in the chat that I'm excited to keep unpacking. But Josh, how does it show up for you, or how do you frame this?
Yeah, this is one that when I have clients who are really high and driven, the conversation, I started out by saying, this is driven is trying to figure out how Superman flies faster. Like we all know that Superman can fly and we've kind of accepted that, but then there's an expectation that at times he can fly faster. But how does that happen? What are the physics behind it? And driven translates similarly for me when I'm working with clients because everybody knows that they had to be driven to get to the position that they're in and that that was often the behavior that was rewarded. They very few of them can figure out, I don't know how to fly faster, right? I don't know how to do more of the thing that got me to this point. And so then we can dive into the conversation of, okay, so what behavior shift needs to happen because it's tough for Superman to fly faster in a sustainable way.
I love that you're kind of already hitting on this, but I'm curious, what are maybe some of the inner beliefs or assumptions that make it easier for a leader to rely on being driven or to lean into that idea, like you just mentioned, Josh, of, well, this is what got me here. So how do I, why not just do this more, right? Why not just lean into it? What are some of those maybe underlying assumptions that could be assisting a leader in leaning in that way?
I'd like to think about trust and Charles Feltman's four elements of trust: competence, reliability, sincerity, and care. And particularly the competence and the reliability piece are the external result of work ethic, of going above and beyond, of staying late, and in conversations and on KPIs, those are rewarded to say, I stayed up all night. I got only 4 hours of sleep. I was in the office until 11 p.m. And that continuous feedback loop feeds into that internal system, which is saying, I need to work harder. I need to prove myself. I need to gain ground here to be safe. And that's, I think, the underlying piece of the worth and safety aspect that's related to this driven capacity that ultimately makes it unsustainable when you rely on outside forces to give you that validity and sense of self-worth.
Yeah, I think that's the fear part there is with most of the folks that I work with, what is typically driving it is, I've set this new floor for myself. I have this reputation that I have created about my work ethic and the way that I get things done, and I'm reliable and all of these things. And so you start to form your identity around being that person, and then once you get to a point where, hey, maybe that isn't sustainable, the panic sets in of, okay, so if this is my floor, if this is what I'm known for, and this is what got me here, I can't possibly let anything dip below what I have shown people already. And so I have to keep going and keep, increasing the level of that floor. It's really challenging.
I just noticed that Krista has a great question in the chat, so I want to bring that forward. Which she's asking, how do you support someone in this state, in that state of mind, and who's driven? Is there an expectation that, I'm also going to have to stay until 11 p.m. I'm also going to have to do these things and match this energy?
I think that what's helpful is to discern how you can move forward with intention versus compulsion, feeling like you have to do this, like there's no other choice. So the goal for me in using this tool is to expand the range of options and to see what's going to fuel you long term and to fuel the range of systems that you hope to tend to, your body, your family, your community, and your work in tandem, which tends to be what the shared commonality that people want, but they're stuck in this short-term fear mentality that keeps them locked into this driven behavior and mindsets.
Yeah, I think if we're looking at it from the aspect of an individual who works with a highly driven individual, there was a really interesting. So I worked with a really high functioning, really successful sales organization, and when we did the profiles for their C-suite team, almost every one of them universally came back with high driven as a factor. Right. Then we did the profiles for the next layer down in that organization, all the people who reported to that C-suite, and the complying behaviors were the highest. Right. And so that question of how do you support someone like this, often I think what I see is people shift into, I don't know how to support it, so I'm going to say yes to everything, and I'm just going to try and make sure they're not mad at me, right? They flip over into that mode. And so that I think takes work too, is the people who are enabling this driven behavior need to shift out of some of that complying behavior as well.
Oh, that's really insightful. I would also be curious if you have noticed in your clients and leaders that you work with, how does the cultural context, for example, like where someone grew up or the kind of family dynamic, the cultural dynamic that they grew up in, how does that play a role, or does that play a role in kind of shaping the driven pattern, the driven behaviors that you see in leaders?
Absolutely. And there was a question about the gender dynamics. Somebody posted in the chat too. We are positioned individuals. We are born into a place and a context, and it's inescapable to escape that reality. And I think that one of my favorite questions that I found effective in these leadership circle profile debriefs is to ask, who are your role models? And to get them to think about the people that they admire and the qualities. And often that people start with acknowledging family members, aunts, uncles, parents, people that they admire. And then we can distill some of the qualities, some of which may be those driven behaviors that got family members through hard times and got their family to where they are. So digging back into their roots and their positionality is a great place to acknowledge the benefits, the short-term benefits of the driven qualities.
Yeah, that's I'm one of those folks that fit into that category. You know, I was raised by a single mom who was a driver. She was a hustler. She always made sure that we had everything. We grew up relatively poor, but she was the kind of mom that made sure that we never knew it, right? And so my influence growing up was always seeing that driven work ethic, multiple jobs at the same time, never stop moving. If you stay in the same spot for more than 1 second, something bad is going to happen, right? And so when I work with really driven people, I reflect on my own history and what it took to kind of break out of that thought process. But that is really tough because the things that we're taught, both from our family as well as the organizations that we work in, do influence how we interact. Right. And I think of, I work with a leader now that they've put in their email signature line, my hours may not be your hours. And yes, that's a great thing because she emails, 24 hours a day. She's kind of always on in that driven category. She's put that in her signature line to try and convince other people that they don't need to match that behavior. But sometimes what can happen there is that people will see that and they'll say, she doesn't mean that. She's not serious about that. And the behavior I see getting rewarded is actually the opposite of that. Right. And so that environmental cause around driven is really big and can't be ignored for sure.
So it's not even just where you grew up or how the family you grew up in. It's a constant environmental, contextual, or cultural context that you're adjusting to or trying to live within with dimensions.
And Abigail, I wonder if you've seen the shift in behavior with clients when they get around that and they get environmentally in that. People who are not necessarily naturally in that space, how do you see them kind of like show up? Or because I see panic in my folks that are not naturally like that, and then they have to be like that because of the people they're around. They don't necessarily know how to deal with that. I'm curious if your experience is the same.
I see leaders who then over apply that drive behavior by taking on too much. They are moving quickly, and physical behavior, they tend to be clenching their jaw, shallow breath, that sort of thing. And there's just a general exhaustion of they are running, and then lay flat on the floor and can't move. And that high dips and high peaks shows up and is not sustainable for leadership is an endurance sport. And so I think people quickly realize that they can't stay that way. But panic is a good way to describe it, because that frenetic energy and that sort of wide look in their eyes is visible to see, and just like want to give people a hug.
Well, I think that's one of the risks too, right? As we talk about the risk to the individual that has the driven behavior, but there is also risk that your choice to be there will also cost you good people and skills along the way, because they can't keep up, and they will choose to leave your orbit versus continue to get burned by it, right?
Yeah, and that, I think what you're saying too is, as you elevate, people are looking to you to see how you're behaving, how you're showing up. And I love the Pepsi CEO who leaves loudly every day and says, I'm going home to my kids. I'm going to take care of my family. It is off the clock time, and you will not hear from me or see me or get Slack messages from me after this time, and to honor that commitment. And I've seen the dissonance when a leader says that they are going to rest and that they are exhibiting these qualities, especially as they start to become self-aware, but then send long Slack messages at 11 p.m. to their team and that disconnect is often can be the sign of growth. They're saying something and doing something different, and being able to be a coach and alongside of somebody to keep pointing that out with space to say, culture, everything has rewarded you and pushed you towards that behavior. So it's okay. And who are you if you slow down, when you slow down?
I want to use these last couple of comments as a great segue into sort of our next section, where we start to talk about using the driven dimension as an entry point into a coaching session or a conversation or a debrief. And Abigail, I particularly want to pick up on what you're talking about, where you were talking about the sensation in the body, like somebody lying flat, you just want to give them a hug. I've heard you talk about using that somatic embodiment in your coaching practice. So talk a little bit more, if you can, about, how driven shows up in the body, and how can a leader identify this and recognize it as, this reactive element?
Yeah, I'll give us a few that we can actually try on this call here too. Is that now we're all in a forward-facing relational environment and tend to be a fight or flight. We're in proximity visually that senses that we should be making an interaction. So our eyes are forward in our bodies. So you can sense what it's like to have your eyes rest back in their sockets just for a minute. And another exercise I love, there's a book called Second Circle and Practices in Improv, where first you turn your toes inward and you notice everything that happens in cascades because of that. Your head goes down, your shoulders hunch in, and this is the do not disturb sign. We need first circle times to do internal work and to focus on what's immediately around us. Then there's third circle, where you point your toes outward and you notice everything that cascades, the Amy Cuddy behavior, the I am ready, I'm here to give a presentation or an interview, and we need this behavior to give speeches and to declare our boundaries and what we need. And then there's second circle, where your feet are parallel to one another. There's even weight on the front and back of your feet, and you're able to discern your internal landscape and somatic cues and the external environment within a reasonable range. And so just noticing that there's those different ways of being can help leaders put themselves in a position where they can physically, the position that can then orient their mindsets and their behaviors to match their intentions.
I love that. Sorry, Josh, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the physical nature of where it shows up. I used to do an activity with folks where we would imagine that every day that you walked into the office that you worked at, there was an individual that the company paid to stand there at the door, and they would either, when you walked in, give you a 5-second shoulder massage, or when you walked in the door, they would scream in your face. One of those two things was going to happen every day when you walked in, and so when you walk in the door, the question always was, which one of those did you prepare for? And universally the answer is I'm prepared to be scared. And so that driven behavior, I think that for you, that anxiety comes up and you think, if I let my guard slip today, it's the same as that preparation to be scared by that person when you walk in the door. If I let my guard down, if I let my performance slip today, I'm going to be called out. I'm going to be a failure. I'm going to lose the next position. I'm going to lose the next thing that is available to me. And for everybody around you, you create that anxiety feeling because they are waiting for you to attack them for not being driven in the same way that you are, right? And so I think where it shows up physically is a lot of what Abigail just mentioned, those physical postures, but also that mental prep of I'm ready for the next attack that's coming, no matter if it's coming or not. And wow, is that an energy waste? Being always prepared for that next thing that's coming, right?
And I find it interesting that those are protective behaviors. And then I think of how this driven is set within the controlling behaviors and how we want to control and be certain of what's happening next. And the uncertain, getting comfortable with the uncertainty and having people feel the sense of we don't know what's going to happen, and that's okay because we're here and we have each other's backs, and we're interested in innovative, disruptive thinking that can be different than it was yesterday. That comfortability with uncertainty and mystery, I think, is the underbelly of this all, that not needing to control.
I think that's really important, and a really great point that folks should probably even write down is that driven, the maybe the resulting behavior is that when I'm super driven, I also may make the mistake of doing the thing I know that works instead of innovating and doing creative things and including other people in that process. When I'm driven, I'm looking to save time, energy, and effort in order to put it all into being the best and being the next person up for the promotion. And so I'm going to rely on the behaviors that have always worked instead of exactly what you're talking about, Abigail, that idea of creativity and let's be inclusive and let's keep composure and let's let people fail and fail fast and do all those things. That's a really good point.
Well, and what's brilliant about the leadership circle profile is playing with the opposites and using the visual graph as a way to say what's directly opposite of driven, and seeing how the mentoring and the collective focus on collaboration is what can help to cultivating the opposite behaviors in the relational side of the graph can help to orient you away from your stance and posture and position in the company, and use a focus on others and lifting people up. First off, you can delegate, so your workload actually goes down from a quantitative perspective, and you're working with the nervous system not at the fight or flight level, but there's also a response of tend and befriend. So how can you tend and befriend your own nervous system response, but also the other people in your organization to say, what do you need? How can I help? And that's a great way to use the graph to show how you can visually move into a creative capacity mindset and belief system that can be sustainable to get work done long term, because there's more of you, and we know the sum is greater than the individual parts or people.
If I can, let me interject here because I want to stay a little bit on this idea of the relationships between the dimensions and what you see. I love that complementary relationship that you pointed out, Abigail, between driven and kind of the more relating, mentoring and developing collaboration dimensions. We have a sample profile that I can share my screen and pull up so we can kind of take a look at some of these things. And I'm curious. I'll go ahead and share my screen, folks, so you can see it. But I'm curious if you can maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the key relationships? What are some of the things that you tend to look to help inform a conversation or a coaching session when you are using driven as an entry point?
Oh, can we take like a 2 second pause and let folks in the chat, what about this profile and specifically the driven category brings your eye to it, or driven or anything on the profile in relation to driven? Can we just do a quick chat exercise with that?
Absolutely.
Just throw it in there without any outside influence. What makes your brain go, oh, that's interesting?
Yes. See someone mention right away low balance,
Yeah.
huge gap between self-assessment score and evaluator score.
Personal rating versus all the other raters. Good one, Will. Awesome. Cool. That just helps with a little bit of context for me. Sorry, I'm a context guy. I had a leader once describe me as if you ask Josh to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, he'll ask you how the world was built first. So it's helpful.
That's quite an ask. All right, so I'll do my best. I can zoom in, if we need to. Most of us are probably somewhat familiar with the circle anyway, but so yeah. So what stands out? I mean, and people I see are still commenting in the chat, which is awesome. But what maybe are some of these relationships that are informative when you're talking about driven?
And I'm zooming and going up. The one for me that does really stand out, and I think this is common with highly driven people, is there's four pieces to this. So one, and a couple of people mentioned it in the chat, driven is the others rating of driven is higher, much higher than the self rating. On the other side, the self perception of balance is also much higher than the others rating. And those two things, I think, for most of the people I see in this category, often create tension. If I perceive myself as less driven and having more balance than the people around me perceive, A, it might not be true. I might be just telling myself a story there. And B, others are going to interpret my impact is going to be different than I want it to be based on how others are seeing my behaviors. I might have the best intent in the entire world, but the impact that I'm going to have, everyone else is viewing it through their own personal filters and the lens of this is a driven person with low balance. And so that can lead to a ton of misinterpretation of how I'm showing up.
I love
I
that.
think what Carol said is interesting too, the how achieving is low and there's a lot of room to grow. And that is the positive sort of correlate to driven. There's a relationship between those things where achieving can be a sustainable way of getting results, whereas driven is a short-term solution that tends to cause burnout.
That's really informative to me. I also think it's interesting when you mentioned earlier, Abigail, how driven is in controlling, but those protecting behaviors show up so often when you're doing that and looking at the self scores are super high in some of those protecting behaviors.
Yeah. And Deborah mentioned the question of addiction and exploring that. And I think the external incentive systems are set up to motivate driven behavior that is unhealthy and unsustainable for the long run.
I love it. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now so we can see faces again. One last thing before we kind of move on to the conversation starters and coaching discussions piece is that we've heard that, it's really helpful to kind of dig into the actual questions on the LCP that are related to driven. So those statements are, I drive myself excessively hard. I'm a workaholic. I try too hard to be the best at everything that I take on. I push myself too hard. Personally, those feel kind of obvious to me. Do you find, or what is your finding working with leaders? How self-aware are they about sort of driven and that fine line between where it can really help you in achieving and when it starts to go too far?
I think this is one that is really hard to be self-aware about because of the nature of the category, right? If I'm excessively driven, there's an underlying fact there that the reason I'm obsessively driven is because I always feel like I'm not good enough. And so to answer these questions of I drive myself excessively hard, if I'm driven, I'm going to say, well, no, I'm not driving myself hard enough. In fact, I'm a workaholic. No, yes, I work more than everybody else, and I'm addicted to being in the office first and leaving last, but that's not excessive. I'm not a workaholic. I still see a movie once every quarter. So like all of those like things that come out work against my own, like the behavior works against my own self-perception of how I'm engaging in the behavior, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Abigail, what do you think?
I think staying curious and open, as Josh was saying, it's hard to be self-aware, and the line is fine between what driven looks like and what achieving results looks like and what is motivating that. I like to ask about definitions in any coaching engagement. Let's get clear. And that was coming up. And what does driven mean? And I think it's important to be clear that we're using the LCP's definition of driven here and talking about that shared understanding. And I ask the same thing in a coaching engagement: is what does rest mean to you? How do you rest? How do you feel when you are resting? And that can help to uncover things like I'm completely anxious. I don't know how to rest. Or rest feels good and a natural part of the rhythms. And I like to play with my kids and take long walks. And so you can gather a lot of information by asking, what does this word mean to you? And in this context, I like to ask about the word rest. And you could ask about what does driven mean to you as well, to ensure that you and your client are on the same page about what this means in this context.
I love that. And that's a perfect segue into kind of getting coaching conversations started. Because one of my first questions is, what are some questions that you find useful to exploring, the driven dimension? So asking, for how a leader defines rest or defines driven seems like an excellent first way to start. Josh, do you have any kind of go-to questions or things that you like to ask?
Yeah, when I have a client that is high in driven, especially, we will focus on some of that definition piece, but then I also tend to go towards, what are you sacrificing in order to maintain that level of driven? What is the thing that you're giving up that you would like to be more a part of your experience in order to maintain that? And sometimes they have an answer. Sometimes the answer is nothing. But it gives me good insight into where to go next, because if their thought is, I'm not giving up anything, then they probably still view this as a very sustainable approach to business, right? If they have some things that they talk about of, oh, I didn't do this and I missed this with my kids, or I missed this with my partner. If they're having thoughts like that, then I know that we can go in a direction of, okay, so how do we shift out of that? And those are two different sort of, paths that we can follow.
I love that. And Abby, I just saw your comment there. You want to mention what you just put in the chat as another question?
These are in general. This is related to drive, but I think this speaks directly to these behaviors and internal assumptions about the feeling, your felt sense and perception of the cost that your work has on there's a cost to everything. There's trade-offs. And so acknowledging those trade-offs and feeling good about missing your kid's soccer game. Sometimes maybe you feel good about it because it led to an opportunity that can support your family long-term. But if it's on a consistent basis and your relationship to missing that soccer game is negative, then you can start to unpack and say, okay, what do you want it to cost you? What do you want it to give back? And to whom are you giving back to? And that gets to bigger systems thinking too around how is your presence and your work supporting your community? And that's, I think, part of the distinction between this compulsive need to drive versus this intention, this purpose, this meaningful achieving that gets you results that you feel good about that is in line with your core values that you've set out to do, which a lot of people have a blend of personal, team, and organizational values. And so to get at the underlying pieces of why are you achieving results? Why are you driven? That can help to orient leaders to show up more in line with how they want to be.
Josh, Tina put in this in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw it, but she's wanting you to kind of keep going with what you were saying a minute ago, that if a leader still sees their behavior as sustainable, where do you go next?
Yeah, there's a couple places there. I think the next question generally I ask is, what's the proof of that? What evidence is there that this behavior is sustainable? And talk about the benefits and risks of continuing it. So really have a really good exploratory conversation around the results, not only for yourself, but for those around you of the behavior. The other thing that I think is really helpful here is to say, okay, so I love what Abigail just said about the core values and bringing it back to who you are. We do an exercise where we talk about your core values, and I believe this even when it costs me. And so when I ask that question of clients and they talk about the core values that they believe even when it costs them, most folks I found will say, something like my family, my kids, my partner. I believe that family is a core value even when it costs me. So then we can run those two things together and say, okay, so how is driven and being obsessively driven at work still in alignment with that core value that you say you believe, even if it has the potential to cost you? That tends to be a really good, sort of creative conversation that folks tend to have. And they may still walk out of it saying, yes, I believe this is sustainable. So then we'll shift into, is it short-term or long-term sustainable? If you think 40 years from now, can you still maintain the line always goes up level of productivity that you've established? Is that realistic?
I want to address what Krista is saying in terms of what if C-suite views driven as positive and necessary. And there's two pieces I'm going to bring in. The Alex Hormozy talks about this. Some of asterisk next to this, but I think that there are times of intense focus that are required sometimes. And being a technology executive, there are things that need to be shipped, there are deadlines, and there are sometimes lives on the line in people's work that makes it so that you need to work back-to-back 16-hour days. I'm currently residing in Minneapolis, and there is work to be done in the short term that is rapid response that requires sustained focus that is short term. But I think getting clear with a C-suite team, if you want to be there long term, of what they mean by driven and do they see this as a long-term sustainable behavior, that can help you understand, is this a place that I want to be, or are there expectations unrealistic and the cost too high to my values, my family, my community, and what I see as success defined in my terms, and making sure that those two things overlap. The other thing I want to bring into the conversation, I think it's easy to override our body signals. I'm an endurance athlete. I do long distance running. And so I've been trained to some extent to ignore my body cues that say, my legs hurt, I am done. My feet are really not wanting to take another step. And again, sometimes that's needed to complete a 50-mile race. And in the long term, I know that if I want to get to mile 50, I need to stop and stretch my knee or do something to take care of myself. So Brene Brown and Tara Brach have good work around relating the words of empathy, of feeling for other people, and compassion, which includes yourself and is a sustainable form of caring. So I see people overextend and give excuses or rationale for why they need to be driven to achieve results that are purposeful, and they feel they're with good intent. But I think the important piece of understanding the ecosystems of yourself and taking care at all altitudes is important, where you can bring yourself into the equation to be sustainable, to support the same systems you're achieving results for, over the long term. And that, again, is what I think is brilliant about the LCP, is that it doesn't, the reactive tendencies are short-term behaviors that are likely leading to success and could be or have been important to your journey and needed, but it's the long-term creative generative capacities that we're looking to cultivate, because this is a long game.
And the recognition on that in that short-term gain, there are gifts, right? Every reactive behavior has some gifts to it, as long as you remember to shift out of it when it becomes unsustainable, for sure.
We've got a lot of questions to get to in the chat, and I want to be sure to get to that. But you just touched on something, like especially this thinking about short term versus long term. I want to touch on one thing before we move into the Q&A, which is kind of maybe some practical in the trenches on the ground steps. So if a leader wanted to work on Driven this month, what are one or two maybe small but high impact practices that you would encourage?
I'm working with Atomic Habits. I picked up the workbook here while I'm traveling just to see what James Clear has to say about building stacking habits and how do you make it easy, reduce the friction. He has a philosophy about how to build in these tiny changes of behavior that can lead to big results over time. And so I would ask a leader what they're already doing and have them define a form of rest that feels achievable, and then stack it next to something they already do. Is you brush your teeth every day. So after you brush your teeth, maybe you do something else. The one that I love that I use a lot is bio breaks, is that we all have to get up and go take a break during the middle of the day. And a bio break you can use is a term to tend to your body. So if you can often get away with 2 minutes of setting it. I love timers as a way to say, do your thing in the bathroom and then set a 2-minute timer to move and breathe and be in any way that you want. There's no restrictions. The goal and task is really just to listen. And that could be stillness, that could be jumping jacks, that could be something, but you're putting into action that value of listening, responding, resting. And that, I think, can just help you discern your internal landscape, get some sensory vocabulary, or at least felt sense of your interoception, what is going on, what you need. And then you can go back into the day and engage in a more intentional way.
Yeah, with clients that I work, those are all really good. And similarly, I tell folks, I want you to be a good scientist. When we leave our session today, the first thing that we're going to talk about next time is your scientific observations. Just go out and be a good scientist about what is short-term and what is long-term sustainable about your current behavior. And just an open-ended question that easily, identified. And then the other thing I asked them to do is take 5 minutes and just write a couple things down. Because that's the other challenge, I think, working with Driven folks, is that if you ask them to do elaborate, self-reflection, homework, all of those take time away from the thing that they are being driven towards. And so they're less likely to complete the activity. And so exactly to Abigail's point, 2 minutes when you take a bio break, 5 minutes to go through a gratitude exercise or something that helps you reflect. Those are sort of the micro asks that can help get someone to reflect on this driven behavior that they won't immediately dismiss because they take too much time.
And I love that. And bringing in the experiential learning cycle of how our brains actually process information. Often C-suite executives want it to be a learning organization. You're intaking information, you're ingesting, and you're getting 1% better. That's what we can agree on. And the way to get there, we can look to science too, to say, you need to try something, you need to do something, you need to reflect on it, and you need to abstract and see where else though that logic might apply. So Josh, I love the reflection, and the having a pen and paper, I think, is a really physical, tangible way for leaders to have to stop to get into the habit of making meaning out of their experiences and feeling like they have a choice in the matter. I think that's at the end of the day what we're here to do as coaches, is to expand the possibility and the repertoire of the range of what they think is possible for themselves and for their teams.
Those are excellent and fantastic. Okay, we do have some great questions that have come in, and so I want to make sure we have a few minutes for those. The first one is this: can you please comment on the relationship between driven and integrity, and maybe as driven as driving us to cut moral corners sometimes?
The question being, what is the relationship between integrity and driven?
Yeah, I think this also stemmed from looking at the sample profile where there was a relationship between integrity and driven, which I can pull that up again if you'd like to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me.
You don't need to pull it up. No, I think when you're in a driven state as defined by the LCP, your nervous system is in a state where it is in fight or flight, and you're not able to make choices and access your executive functioning so clearly. And that can put you in a place where you're not acting intentionally. I think of the word integrity is comes from integral, or the root of whole. And so thinking about, if you're driving results into a particular place, are you acknowledging the whole of the systems and the costs to those systems?
Yeah, and integrity, I talk a lot about it being that, again, back to that core value alignment. And if you are excessively driven, are you really anchored in your core values? Or are you only responding to the external punishment and reward that comes with being driven? And I think that's often a lot of folks that I see, integrity is lower and courageous authenticity is lower with folks that are highly driven, because it's only response, 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 response. There's stimulus, response. There isn't, does this align? Am I putting it through the filter of my core values?
Viktor Frankl, the meaning, he talks a lot about the stimulus and the response and the space between that we often don't acknowledge, to say that you can cultivate this it can be a pause, and it can be a microscopic just moment of noticing that, oh, I could move in a different direction.
Yeah. I share this quote a lot, but it's from a CEO of a company I used to work with, and this was a company that focused a lot on the culture of the organization. And what he always used to say is, once we know who we are, the decision-making process gets easier. And so that integrity piece, I think, is linked to a lot of the other behaviors, but specifically driven, because if I'm rooted in core values and in integrity, I know who I am. And so my decision making feels fast still, but it's a little bit more aligned with how I want to operate and the things I don't want to sacrifice to operate that way.
Excellent. Okay, next question. What's one question that leaders could ask themselves this week to notice when driven is in choice, is intentional, versus when it is reactive and compulsory, within compulsion? So what's one question that leaders could ask themselves this week to help them notice when driven is a choice versus when it's a compulsion?
How do I feel in my body when I'm doing this action? And when I think of types of work, and when discerning what kind of commitments, I think of who am I? Do I like who I am when I'm doing this behavior? And that can be a good way to notice and discern.
Yeah, I think a question to ask yourself is, was I ever comfortable being still this week? If I'm reflecting back and I realize, ooh, the moments that I got to sit still were the ones that I was least comfortable, and I felt like I wasn't doing enough and I wasn't doing the thing I should be doing. If I never felt comfortable in a still moment, that's probably an indicator I've got something to work on.
Love that. Okay, here, next question. What does progress with Driven actually look like? Like not in theory, but in real life on the ground.
I'm going to post, I just put in the chat some sensation language, and I think it's often a vocabulary of words that can describe their current state of being where they're not overriding. So you can track language in an expanded vocabulary by there's more nuanced ways of describing their current state, that they're in touch with the costs and how they're feeling and responsive to their needs.
I think one of the longer term indicators is that the team that you work with begins to use we language instead of me or you language. Driven folks are often highlighted as, top performers, MVPs, and often the lens is focused 100% on them. When you notice your team start shifting to a we did this, we took part in this, we made this happen type of mindset and language, that's an indicator your work in Driven is being successful.
That's great. Okay, I want to go back to one of our earlier questions that came in. So this was someone commenting on how, if Driven's part of our reactive tendency, it's kind of an automatic way of being. How do we reward people for creating those new neural pathways and new neural programming? And I think this is the crux of the question. Do you always have to wait until Driven equals burnout until you kind of get to the extreme? Or can you insert, or can you interrupt, or can you do things earlier in the process and before it gets to overexhaustion and overexertion and burnout?
I've seen leaders add in mental health days to their benefits packages to say, we reward and acknowledge you as, even if your body isn't feeling good, if you need to take time for your family or you don't have to explain, but we will put this in and expect this behavior for you to take time off occasionally for things you don't need to go into elaborate detail on that isn't a doctor's appointment or a functional even thing that is validated, that no questions asked, you get time off. And that, I think, is a tangible way to reward and acknowledge and build in time in the company logic capacity for people to be human.
Love that. Love that.
I think it is really hard for people to recognize this before they burn out, but I also not but and sorry my improv training kicking in as well, and I think that if they've even had a little bit of that feeling of burnout, which most folks in corporate world have, we can point to an example of a time that we felt burnt out. We as coaches can anchor to the feeling that they had when they were there and say, how do we avoid that feeling in the future? So I don't know if it is possible for driven people to acknowledge that they are excessively driven without having that feeling, but I also think that driven people have had that feeling a lot. So
that makes a lot of sense. Well, look, we've only got 3 minutes until the top of the hour, so I'm going to close it up here. But I just want to say, gosh, that was a great conversation. I'm seeing similar comments in the chat that we came for Driven and got so much more. So thank you first and foremost, Josh and Abigail, for taking time with us and sharing all of this with us today. And thank you, all of us, for joining us and being a part of this conversation. Love to see such an active comments section. Love to see everybody sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. Invite you back next month in March when we surface insights in the collaborator creative competency with coaches Jen Bieri and Yvette Stobo. Be sure to watch your inbox and Leadership Circle social media for details and for other surfacing creative leadership announcements, events, and resources. And stay tuned for the rest of the year. We'll be diving into dimensions including systems thinker, pleasing, mentoring and developing, mentioned today, integrity, mentioned today, sustainable productivity, arrogance, and many more. So I hope you will join us. I hope we'll see you again next time. And for now, on behalf of Leadership Circle and our featured coaches, Abigail Jones and Josh Best, I'm Sarah saying thank you so much for your time and attention today and your participation. We'll see you again next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for showing up. Bye.